The Subjectivity of the Real by Giovanni Gentile. Berkeley, in the beginning of the 18th century, expressed very clearly the following concept. Reality is conceivable only insofar as the reality conceived is in relation to the activity which conceives it, and, in that relation, it is not only a possible object of knowledge, it is a present and actual one. To conceive a reality is to conceive at the same time, and as one with, the mind in which that reality is represented. And, therefore, the concept of a material reality is absurd. To Berkeley, it was evident that the concept of a corporeal, external, material substance, that is, the concept of bodies existing generally outside the mind, is a self-contradictory concept, since we can only speak of things which are perceived, and, in being perceived, things are objects of consciousness, ideas. Berkeley, with his clear insight, remarked that there is surely nothing easier than to imagine trees in a park, or books existing in a closet, and nobody being by to perceive them. But, in such case, all that we do is to frame in our mind certain ideas which we call books and trees, and at the same time omit to frame the idea of any one who may perceive them. It is not therefore really the case that no mind perceives them. The perceiver is the mind which imagines them. The object, even when thought of as outside every mind, is always mental. This is the point on which I desire to concentrate attention. The concept of the ideality of the real is a very difficult one to define exactly, and it did not, in fact, prevent Berkeley himself from conceiving a reality effectively independent of mind. For Berkeley, notwithstanding that happy remark, came himself to deny the ideality of the real, in declaring that reality is not properly an object of the human mind, and contained therein, nor, strictly speaking, a thought of that mind, but the totality of the ideas of an objective absolute mind, whose existence the human mind presupposes. He contradicted the fundamental principle of his whole thought. Berkeley, indeed, even while saying esse est percipi, even while making reality coincide with perception, distinguished between the thought which actually thinks the world, and the absolute, eternal thought, which transcends single minds, and makes the development of single minds possible. From the empirical point of view, at which as a pre-Kantian idealist Berkeley remained, it is obvious and appears incontrovertible that our mind does not think all the thinkable, since our mind is a human mind, and therefore finite. And the minds of finite beings exist only within certain limits of time and space. And then, too, we are able to think there is something which exists even though actually it may never yet have been thought. It seems undeniable, then, that our mind has not as the present object of its thought everything which can possibly be its object. And since whatever is not an object of human thinking at one definite historical empirical moment seems as though it may be such an object at another such moment, we come to imagine another thinking outside human thinking, a thinking which is always thinking all the thinkable, a thought which transcends human thought, and is free from all the limits within which it is or can be circumscribed. This eternal, infinite thinking is not a thinking like ours which feels its limits at every moment. It is God's thinking. God, therefore, is the condition which makes it possible to think man's thought as itself reality, and reality as itself thought. Now, it is evident that if we conceive human thinking as conditioned by the divine thinking, even though the divine thinking does not present itself to us as an immediate reality, then we produce, in the case of human thinking, the same situation as that in which mind is confronted with matter, that is, with nature, regarded as ancient philosophy regarded it, a presupposition of thought, a reality to which nothing is aided by the development of thought. If we conceive reality in this way, we make it impossible to conceive human thought, because a reality which is already complete, and which when presented to thought does not grow and continue to be realized, is a reality which in its very conception excludes the possibility of conceiving that presumed or apparent new reality, which thought would then be. It was so with Berkeley. He had given expression to a clear, sound, suggestive theory, strikingly analogous to modern idealistic doctrine, declaring that when we believe we are conceiving a reality outside the mind, we are actually ourselves falsifying our belief by our simple presence in the act of perceiving, and when we presume ourselves absent, even then we are intervening and powerless to abstain from intervening in the very act by which we affirm our absence. When he had given expression to this doctrine, he himself returned to the standpoint of the ancient philosophy, with the result that he had failed to conceive the thinking which truly creates reality, the thought which is itself reality. This was precisely the defect of the ancient thought. For it, thinking strictly conceived was nothing. Modern philosophy, after full consideration, puts forward simply, with all discretion, the very modest requirement that thinking shall be something. No sooner, however, does modern philosophy acknowledge this modest requirement, that it feels the necessity of going on to affirm thinking as not simply something, as not only an element of reality, or an appurtenance of reality, but as indeed the whole, or absolute reality. From Berkeley's standpoint, thinking, strictly, is not anything, because insofar as the thinking thinks, what it thinks is already thought. For human thought is only a ray of the divine thought, and therefore not something itself new, something other than that divine thought. And even in the case of error, which is indeed ours and not God's, our thinking, as thinking, is not anything. Not only is it not objective reality, but it is not even subjective reality. Were it something new, divine thought would not be the whole. The Kantian philosophy places us at a new standpoint, though Kant himself was not fully conscious of its significance. With Kant's concept of the transcendental ego, it is no longer possible to ask Berkeley's question, how is our finite thinking thinkable? Our thinking and what we think are correlative terms. For when we think and make our own thinking an object of reflection, determining it as an object by thinking, then what we think, that is, our very thinking itself, is nothing else than our own idea. Such thinking is finite thinking. How is it possible for it to arise? It is our present actual thinking. It is, that is to say, the actualization of a power. A power, which is actual, must have been possible. How is it possible? Berkeley, in perceiving that this thinking is actual, feels the need to transcend it, and he is right. It is the question which sprang up in the inmost center of the Kantian philosophy. And, to answer it, Kant had recourse to the concept of the noumenon. But this concept has really no ground. Once we have mastered the concept of thinking as transcendental thinking, the concept of mind as self-consciousness, as original apperception, as the condition of all experience. Because if we conceive our whole mind as something finite, by thinking of it as a present reality, a present with a before and an after from which its reality is absent, then what we are thinking of is not the transcendental activity of experience, but what Kant calls the empirical ego, radically different from the transcendental ego. For in every act of our thinking, and in our thinking in general, we ought to distinguish two things. On the one hand, what we are thinking. On the other, the we who think and who are therefore not the object but the subject in the thinking act. Berkeley indeed drew attention to the subject, which always stands over against the object. But then the subject which Berkeley meant was not the subject truly conceived as subject, but rather a subject which itself was objectified and so reduced to one of the many finite objects contained in experience. It was the object which we reach empirically whenever we analyze our mental act and distinguish therein. On the other hand, the content of our consciousness, and, on the other, the consciousness as the form of that same content. Just as in vision we have two objects of the one experience, the scene or the term which we may call the object, and the I or the term which we may call the subject, so also in our actual living experience, not only is the object of that experience an object, but even the subject by the fact that it is made a term of the experience is an object, and yet the I cannot see itself except as it is reflected in a mirror. If, then, we would know the essence of the mind's transcendental activity, we must not present it as spectator and spectacle. The mind is an object of experience, the subject an outside onlooker. Insofar as consciousness is an object of consciousness, it is no longer consciousness. Insofar as the original apperception is an apperceived object, it is no longer apperception. Strictly speaking, it is no longer a subject but an object, no longer an ego but a non-ego. It was precisely here that Berkeley went wrong, and failed, and, for this reason, he could not solve the problem. His idealism was empirical. The transcendental point of view is that which we attain when, in the reality of thinking, we see our thought not as act done, but as act in the doing. This act we can never absolutely transcend, since it is our very subjectivity, that is, our own self. An act, therefore, which we can never in any possible manner objectify. The new point of view which we then gain is that of the actuality of the I, a point of view from which the I can never be conceived as its own object. Every attempt which we may try it at this very moment, to objectify the I, the actual thinking, the inner activity in which our spiritual nature consists, is bound to fail. We shall always find we have left outside the object just what we want to get in it. For in defining our thinking activity as a definite object of our thinking, we have always to remember that the definition is rendered possible by the very fact that our thinking activity remains the subject for which it is defined as an object, in whatsoever manner this concept of our thinking activity is conceived. The true thinking activity is not what is being defined, but what is defining. This concept may appear abstruse, yet it is the concept of our ordinary life, so long as we enjoy a certain feeling of life as spiritual reality. It is common observation that whenever we want to understand something which has a spiritual value, something which we can speak of as a spiritual fact, we have to regard it not as an object, a thing which we set before us for investigation, but as something immediately identical with our own spiritual activity. And it makes no difference that such spiritual values may be souls with whom our own soul may not be in accord. The apprehension of spiritual value may be realized both through agreement and disagreement, for these are not two parallel possibilities, either of which may be realized indifferently. They are rather two coordinate and successive possibilities, one of which is necessarily a step to the other. It is clear that the first step in spiritual apprehension is the assent, the approbation, for we say that before judging we must understand. When we say that we understand without exercising judgment, it does not mean that we exercise no judgment. We do not indeed judge approval or disapproval, but we do judge provisionally for apprehension. A fundamental condition, therefore, of understanding others is that our mind should penetrate their mind. The beginning of apprehension is confidence. Without it, there is no spiritual penetration, no understanding of mental and moral reality. Without the agreement and unification of our mind with the other mind, with which it would enter into relation, it is impossible to have any kind of understanding, impossible even to begin to notice or perceive anything which may come into another mind. And we are driven by our thinking activity itself into this apprehension of others. Every spiritual relation, every communication between our own inner reality and others is essentially unity. This deep unity we feel every time we are able to say that we understand our fellow being. In those moments, we want more than intellectual unity. We feel the need of loving. An abstract activity we call mind no longer contents us. We want the good spiritual disposition, what we call heart, goodwill, charity, sympathy, open-mindedness, warmth of affection. Now, what is the meaning of this unity? What is this fellow feeling, which is the essential condition of all spiritual communication, of all knowledge of mind? It is quite different from the kind of unity which we experience when, for example, we touch a stone, altogether different in kind from the knowledge of simple nature, of which we call material nature. We find a need to be unified with the soul we would know, because the reality of that soul consists in being one with our own soul, and that other soul, likewise, cannot meet in our soul what is not essentially its own subjectivity. Life of our life, it lives within our soul, where distinction is not opposition. For be it noted, within our own soul, we may find ourselves in precisely the same spiritual situation as that in which we are when we face to face with another soul, which we fain would but do not yet understand. This means that the disproportion and incongruence which we find between our soul and other souls, when they appear to us as mute and impenetrable as the rocks and blind forces of nature, is no other than the disproportion and incongruence within our own soul between its own states, between what it is and what we would have it be, between what we can think but yet fail to realize, between what, as we shall see, is our state, and what is our act.